NGOs, NPOs. I really hope that the San Francisco Bay Area can play a key role in making sure that the U.S. stays engaged in East Asia and that the U.S. is smart in dealing with East Asia. So thank you very much. I've gone a little bit over time, but I'd be happy to.
Thank you, Glenn. My head spins with all the charts. Just a yes or no answer. China is Japan's leading trading partner.
Yes.
True.
Yes.
Okay. I don't think they can always hear you in the back, so okay. I wanted to make sure they heard that. That's true. And as a person who trained at Berkeley with lots of Marxists, they think that that's the most important thing. Secondly, James Fellows has a book. He's coming out to talk to us here in the Bay Area about it, about aviation in China, where China might dominate aviation in the 21st century is a guess. According to Jim, who should know, over half of the airports now being built or nearing completion are in the People's Republic of China. Apparently, Airbus must know this because you can get a lot of Chinese on those big Airbus. So, can you give us an inside secret? Is Airbus targeting mainly the China market?
I think it's an objective fact that the demand for aircraft, commercial aircraft, especially those more than 100 seats, the main growth in recent years has been in Asia and in the Middle East. And so China and India and Southeast Asia are all huge buyers of aircraft, both Airbus and Boeing. And the Chinese are quite adept at working with both Airbus and Boeing in terms of buying aircraft and also in terms of manufacturing aircraft. And I think the Chinese want very much to get good technology so they can build their own domestic aircraft. And also with regard to purchases of aircraft, it's very impressive how they very ironically use the market in their favor. It's supposed to be a socialist economy, but they use the market in their favor. It's very, very, very interesting, at least in the short term. On a transaction-by-transaction basis, they use the market to their advantage, but in the medium and long term, they always maintain a balance. So it's quite interesting. They really manage the market well, I think. I think that with regard to manufacturing aircraft and with regard to operating aircraft, China will certainly grow in importance over the next several years. But I think that the aircraft and airline industry, I think it's hard to try to dominate the industry. I mean, there's so much demand growing for both use of aircraft as well as for manufacturing of aircraft. Although there are only 2 manufacturers of aircraft with more than 100 seats now, in the mid-market, the 70 to 90 seat regional market, right now it's Embraer of Brazil and Bombardier of Canada, but Japan with Mitsubishi Regional Jet and Russia and China are all starting to produce mid-size aircraft. So that mid-size market is going to grow in competitive competition. And then there's the smaller planes as well, including the Honda jet. But so I haven't read Jim's book, so I don't know precisely what his argument is, but I would think it's difficult to be, well, I would not, I find it hard to make the argument that China could dominate the airline or aircraft market because there's so much demand in other parts of the world. So we can talk about that during the...
For an Army brat, you didn't speak anything at all about the enormous impact of the American defense establishment. You are quite right if your guess is that the U.S. Navy repositioned years ago. If you look at the number of capital ships and where they sail to the Pacific, the other side of the Pacific, to the Indian Ocean and to the Persian Gulf. And what you do is you keep numbered fleets like the 6th Fleet with very few ships in them sitting around the Mediterranean and even less in the Atlantic. So this is one point. The second point is that many people fail to see, because the Japanese apparently don't want us to see, that the Japanese naval self-defense forces are the second and most important navy in the Northeast Pacific. Would you agree with that?
military force, but there are some very clear constraints on their deployment. And it's a
Political constraints.
political constraints within Japan, as well as, I think, constraints outside of Japan as well. And so I think the fact that the Japanese self-defense force is a very significant and technologically advanced military force is a fact, but they are not capable of being deployed as would the case be with other countries because of the political constraints within Japan, legal and political constraints within Japan, as well as the reaction or reception that they might receive in certain parts of Asia. Which is not to say that that could change if there are changes in the region, for instance, in North Korea or China.
Do I see a question somewhere else in the audience? I see a hand waving behind me. Could you speak directly into the mic because we're recording, and otherwise it'll be dead space?
Yeah, thank you for your illuminating presentation. I just wanted to maybe expand the discussion just a little bit because you concentrated on the economic aspect of relations between Japan and the U.S. and between Japan and Southeast Asia. If we look in the European Union, there are many Western nations which attempt to westernize neighboring countries. By westernize, I mean modernize along Western values. When I see Japan, I don't see that. Basically, they appear to have a policy of non-interference in neighboring countries, like, for example, in Thailand, when the military took over that country just temporarily because they didn't like the results of the election. I was wondering, do you foresee in the future any change in this policy? Will Japan expand a bit more in terms of influencing neighboring countries, westernizing them? I mean, they must realize that having Western neighbors is a great positive benefit to them.
Well, it's a very interesting question. I think that Japan has hesitated to try to change those countries, especially in Southeast Asia, for several reasons. I think one is that philosophically, I think the Japanese generally believe that there is a kind of an Asian way, loosely termed, hard to define, but an Asian way of politics and of business. For instance, Myanmar is a good example, Burma. I think from the Western perspective, Japan has not been, up to now, as supportive of some of the Western complaints about Myanmar in terms of human rights violations. And so I think so that's one set of concerns. Another concern, I think, at least, and this is going away because of the generational changes, but I think among the older generation in Japan, there still is concern about Japan's legacy of the 1930s of trying to colonize and change, the educational system, the whole system, including changing people's names, and so which still, I think, at least in the older generation, is resented in other parts of Asia. And then there's the third, which is that I think Japan hasn't seen itself to be powerful enough to be able to actually mold and shape these countries politically. But obviously, as you say, it would be in Japan's interest, especially with the growth of China, to counterbalance China in terms of these political and economic values. So I think that we might see Japan working more closely with the United States or with India or other countries with the view to try to not necessarily westernize, but to help create a more open environment for trade and politics and economics and politics in the region.
Would you like to ask a question? I'll give you the microphone. You'd be surprised how it works.
Hi. Historically, China has not been a naval power. But suddenly, from reading the Wall Street Journal, I see a lot of articles now about their making territorial demands all across the East China Sea and South China Sea on various countries. What do you think that's going to affect Japan and other states in that area?
I think it already has affected Japan. I think that there are increasing number of people in Japan, even in the Democratic Party of Japan, which tends overall to be less, confrontational with China than the LDP. there are people like Mr. Maehara, for instance, who was the foreign minister and who could end up as prime minister again, as leader of the party and therefore prime minister, who have expressed openly concerns about lack of transparency in China's use of the money and equipment in the military, especially in the Navy. So I think, yes, I think it has already had an effect on the Japanese sense of security and of threat. But it's not at a point where it has resulted in clear changes in Japanese defense policy. But there's more and more discussion about it, more and more concern about being expressed. And I think within Japan, as well as in the United States, there are varying assessments of what are China's intentions. You know, does China intend as a great power to have a military but not to use it to expand and to conquer territories? Or is it that maybe some people in the political leadership have that view, but the military in China may actually have a more expansionist view? And certainly within the United States, there's a lot of debate about that. I think within Japan as well, there are varying views about the real threat that China poses to the region militarily. But it clearly has raised the attention of people in Japan. And if China continues, as it does, with tremendous outlays of military expenditures and a lot of it not transparent, I think it could eventually result in some clear policy change in Japan.
Here's a question.
Glenn,
Yes.
You said that nobody in Japan knew what the mayor of Osaka stood for, but one of the things he stands for is no more nuclear reactors. And given the popular opinion today in Japan, can he ride this as a populist to become the next prime minister? What do you think?
Well, I said that it's hard to know what he thinks. There may be some parallels with the nominee in the U.S. As well, but he tends to change his views, depending on his audience. And so that's why I said that I think many people don't know really what he stands for. There have been certain things that he's put forward, but then when it hasn't caught the attention or the support, he kind of quickly withdraws it. So I think there's some element of not knowing what his real principles are and what he really stands for. But on the nuclear power issue, it is true that as a result of March 11th, there was such a, what's the best word? Such a concern, I guess, about the problems of Tokyo Electric Power and radiation and the inadequacies in crisis management and what Norimitsu Onishi of the New York Times and others have talked about, the culture of collusion, the LDP, the METI people, the regulators working and promoting the industry, the electric power companies, the regional monopolies. All of that, I think, has led to a popular reaction against the current state of the nuclear industry, certainly, and even the wisdom of having nuclear power in Japan. Now, right after March 11th, I remember that some leaders of the Democratic Party, including Prime Minister Kan, Mr. Maehara, and others publicly said that they felt that the nuclear energy should be phased out over time. I heard a talk that former Prime Minister Koizumi gave about 3 months or 4 months after the March 11th, and he very clearly stated, and he's a very clear guy, he said, this is the end of nuclear power in Japan. Over time, this has got to go. And so for the first several months after March 11th, the mood in Japan was very much towards shutting down nuclear power eventually, not immediately, but over time. However, my impression is that with the passage of time and with increasing concern expressed about Japan's economic competitiveness and viability, there's increasing question as to how realistic it is for Japan to actually completely do away with nuclear power. So I think the business community and some in the political world are becoming more favorable towards nuclear power, all with the assumption that the safety standards and the method of regulation has to change. Now, I have been, this is on the record, so I guess I shouldn't have to be careful, but I attended a meeting of I guess I can say this, a former Prime Minister of Japan who said that in his view, in the next general election, and he thought the general election in Japan would be next year, after the consumption tax issue is resolved. He said that after the consumption tax issue, he thought that the nuclear energy issue was going to be the referendum issue. It was going to be like postal reform that Koizumi had. And if he's right, then this nuclear energy issue could end up as the major issue where people will debate and political leaders, and I guess in this case probably will be the Democratic Party of Japan that is in support of reducing or eliminating an LDP on the other side. That could be a huge issue. And on your specific question about Hashimoto, my impression is that he's going to watch how the wind blows. and if it seems like this is an issue he can ride, he'll ride it. If he thinks it's going to fade away, he will not write it. I think he is very careful in watching which way the wind blows.
This winter, John and I hosted a Nobel Prize winner in physics at Stanford. And his reaction was, this is all political hot wind, that nuclear power is definitely here to stay, and that lots of people will play to lots of crowds. Mrs. Merkel will play as long as she can in Germany, because she's already set up the lines where she will buy all the nuclear power she can get from the French across the border. Oy vey. I'd like to tell you that this is not the end of the year for us, even though those people who are celebrating because they're graduating this week and next week, etc. We have a visit by the San Francisco Opera. They come in the fall, they come in the spring. Next fall, they're coming over Moby Dick, that white whale that hung off the coast of Japan for a while. But this time it's Nixon in China, written by a man who is a composer over in Berkeley. Apparently never read a book about Nixon or Kissinger, so it's a very unusual opera. Nixon comes off as a really nice guy. And Kissinger comes off as a drunk and a womanizer. Nixon's dead, so he doesn't care. But of course, Henry's alive in New York, and he does not like this opera. But it's a very interesting opera. 40 years ago, Richard Mulhouse Nixon left the United States and flew to Beijing and met Chairman Mao Zedong. Certainly is a historic moment, changed power relations, etc. So it's an intriguing way of looking at a historical fact by a non-historian, a composer of music, and he's doing it for us, and San Francisco is premiering it. It's going to be a big hit, they hope. And they're coming here with a soprano who's going to sing all of Pat Nixon's great arias. There aren't that many. And a pianist, and also some of the leading folks who put it together at San Francisco Opera. So you're certainly invited to come, and it's on the outside agenda, so you can pick up a flyer for it. And then you can also join us. Some of you are not members, and if you put your little name with a little email address and a little fishbowl, Kristen Elbers will put you on our mailing list for the rest of your life, and even at your funeral, they'll be reading out that Central Pacific Rim is having a production. So please do join us. We have lots of different members to show you our taste is very Catholic in the true meaning of the word. Next fall, we will have a man explain to you why you're still in Afghanistan. His name is General Eikenberry. He should know. For 4 years, he was the commander on the ground for President Bush Jr., and then for 4 years, he was ambassador for President Obama. He's thrown up his hands. He's now down at Stanford teaching undergraduates, but he's going to come here and teach you why we're still in Afghanistan. Then we're going to flip from there. Isabel Allende has written another novel among the 40 or so that she's writing all the time. This is about a love affair that starts in California and ends up in Chile. And she's going to come and tell you all about love, Hispanic style. She's a wonderful and entertaining speaker, so we certainly would like to see you there. And we have any number of other people. We hope to have some consul generals come here and be talked to and interviewed. And we have already set some relationships, Professor Nelson has, with the Mexican Consul General. So we work around the Pacific Rim at the highlights that we can get. We'll hope, of course, to get James Fallows here so he can explain all about what Airbus is or isn't going to do in the market called China. Please think about coming back to the Pacific Rim. We'll be here for part of the summer. We'll be here the first thing in the fall. We should be the top of your calendar. Also, because she's so wonderful, my friend here sitting in the front row, we've already scheduled the head of the San Francisco Federal Reserve to come here in November and explain to you whether your economy is going to go to hell or not. And so you should come and listen because you might have to move your money somewhere, but not to the euro. Would you please join me in thanking Glenn?
Thank you very much. If I could, I just want to thank you, Patrick, and the university for inviting me. It's been great to be back in San Francisco. And of the two speakers that you mentioned, the two I know are Jim Fallows and Eikenberry, and I would highly recommend that you attend their talks.
But not the Consul Generals?
Of course, that's given.
You caught up.
He already spoke here.
Yeah. And now, because the students are dancing around bonfires and carrying on like crazy, free at last, the famous Martin Luther King statement, we have to have our reception here in this room. So it's over there, the wine and the food, etc. Just don't stampede through these chairs, please. Take your time. There's food for everybody. In fact, I understand it's upscale food, whatever that means.